Good morning, everybody, and thank you for tuning into the Capitalist Cast. Joining me today is the Pennsylvania House Speaker, Bryan Cutler. Speaker, thanks very much for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. I know that you have a pretty hard time limit here, so we're just going to kind of jump right into things. And I appreciate you coming on because, as we were talking about just before the broadcast started, you are really getting into what is a very busy time of year as it relates to the budget process. The governor had his budget address, which has essentially become a wish list of things that are never going to happen. What does the process actually look like from there? How does the legislature approach budgeting?
Sure. The governor having his address on the first Tuesday traditionally is what officially kicks off the budget cycle. And you're correct. It's a lot of pie in the sky, and this is what I'd like to see kind of discussion. So he gave his speech. It was actually a little shorter than many of his others. This was his 8th and final speech. And as I've said, as much as some things change, some things don't. And, the governor, once again, wants to spend an awful lot of money. He did highlight, and I think he's correct, our stronger financial footing that we're currently in right now. But that's in large part because of what the House and the Senate has done over the last 7 budget cycles. In regards to his first budget, he wanted, I think it was $12 or $13 billion in tax increases. We fought those to a 10-month impasse. And as we work through the different budgets, the truth is we were able to put the largest amount of money ever into the rainy day fund. Obviously, we have some of the federal funds that are available over the next 2 budgetary years as well. And so it does look like right now, for this period of time, we do have a large surplus of cash in the state treasury. So where we go from here is the governor concludes his speech. The appropriations committees, both the House and the Senate, will have about 5 weeks of hearings. Those schedules will be published. And there'll be, you can watch the hearings online or possibly attend in person, although some of the rooms, the space is limited, especially for the more interesting hearings, people tend to come. And then the Appropriations Committee and their members will begin working through that process. I think it's important that we stick to a couple key principles as we move forward that really have guided the last 7 budgets. That is, one, live within our means in terms of making sure that, yes, there is money and there are surpluses both in the rainy day fund and the restricted account for the federal money, but the federal money will be gone in 2 years over the next 2 budget cycles. So that's important. And we should not, and this part I actually agree with the governor on. He said that money in the rainy day fund is not an excuse to go on a spending spree. Unfortunately, many of the items in the budget look just like that. So we'll do our due diligence. We'll work through that at the committee level. And then in addition to what the Appropriations Committee is doing, many times we need policy items implemented in addition to the budget. So the individual committees will be working on those. For example, Health and Human Services continues to be one of the fastest growing, and it's already the largest portions of our budget. Out of roughly $40 billion, it's about, it's a large portion. It's about 40% of the budget. So the largest part of Health and Human Services is Medicaid. So we have to look at some serious cost controls there in terms of, what's working, what's not, and are we getting what we're paying for? All of those things will be part of not just the appropriations hearing, but also in our human services, our health committees, and other committees. So it's really a team effort in terms of how we approach that. And then hopefully we could actually get it done not just on time, but preferably early. I think that would be great for the taxpayers to give some level of predictability to them in terms of not just our legislative calendar, but in terms of what our policies are. It's important to remember the budget is a numerical document that represents what we believe is important. So as we work through that process, it's important that we fund the things that work and we are responsible with taxpayer dollars. And that, I think, is what everybody expects from us.
So I guess coming back to the budget just a little bit and the surplus, and one of the things that the governor had mentioned was, we have this surplus of revenue coming in. What that kind of ignores is that the Independence Fiscal Office starting in 2023 puts us at a multi-billion-dollar structural deficit in terms of spending.
Yeah, that's actually something that Chairman Saylor highlighted during his comments on the floor in response to the governor. The governor gave very rosy revenue predictions. And remember, I referenced Health and Human Services. I think that the year-over-year costs have been like 7+% per year in terms of increases. His budget projections put them at 0.9%. And that's how he makes the numbers work. That's where I think that the big difference between his overestimation of revenues decreasing of costs to the tune of about $5 billion over 5 years actually misses the mark on the IFO report that basically says, one, in the next year, we're probably going to have about an $800 million deficit that we're staring at. And then over several years, it will be, in fact, multi-billion. So we have to manage responsibly. That's how we got here, and we shouldn't change course now.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that could really help keep us on that trajectory, kind of regardless of who the governor is, because I mean, one of our criticisms at CAP has been, I mean, we are continuously and regularly spending over inflation and population growth in Pennsylvania. There's some legislation that's been put out, and I mean, it's been out for forever. The Taxpayer Protection Act that would cap some of that spending growth. It's my understanding that there are enough votes in the House to actually pass that. Do you know why the majority leader hasn't calendared that yet?
No, in terms of TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights or Protection Act, TPA, whichever you want to call it, it's a spending control mechanism, which is very important. I think that one, we historically try to do that in terms of year over year. And when you get into the budget, this is important. Oftentimes, the governor will do what they call supplemental expenditures. They will show up and say, oh, by the way, I have this bill here that also needs paid, and it's $700 million more. So sometimes the budget grows beyond what is actually detailed in the budget documents itself. In terms of putting some hard controls in place, that's something that I've personally been in favor of. I would love to see that, because I think it, just like at home, like that, I'm sure you and I run our budgets the same way. You look at how much money comes in, and if the electric bill goes up 1 month, you move the money to pay that, and maybe you don't go out to eat that month. And you make those kinds of decisions. So
but I mean, I'm gonna
in place would actually help us do that.
I'm going to push back a little bit, because and don't get me wrong, over the last few budget cycles, the General Assembly has done better, but I mean, it's consistently come in, even without the supplementals, over that Taxpayer Protection Act mark. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the only time there was one budget in probably the last 15 years where it's hit that actual mark. So why are we not? And I understand that it ties the hands of the Appropriations Committee and some of those kind of things, but that's kind of the point. Will we see something like that come up for a vote in the near future, or is this just something that people are going to continue to use as a campaign line?
Well, I certainly think it would be helpful in terms of setting policy as we go forward. And in terms of the budget, one of the other issues, and I don't want to get too far into the budget details, but it's important. There's a lot of offline spending, Leo, and one of the things that we've been pushing for is to actually bring that all into the daylight, if you will, in the budgetary process. So oftentimes in prior administrations, both Republican and Democrat, if they needed the budget to work out, they'd shift something offline, and they might dedicate a special stream to it or a special fund to it, and it would kind of sit there but not be part of the normal budgetary process. What that means is it's also not being regularly reviewed. Right. And it's not being regularly accounted for in terms of, is that still adequate? Is it too much? Is it too little? That's one of the benefits of the appropriations hearings, I think, because you get to call the secretary, deputy secretaries, or whatever program head in and say, look, I've noticed that you have this. One of the things that we looked at and have consistently been doing is taking some of the money from the offline accounts and trying to get it back to the general fund. There are some of those accounts with hundreds of millions of dollars of surplus in it. And I don't think that's a good use of taxpayer money. Unfortunately, many of them are, politically radioactive. They're an environmental fund, or they're some other fund in terms of what its purpose is. And even, and I'll use tobacco money, for example. There's a surplus in that account because not all the counties provide the match in order to draw it down for farmland preservation. So if we can't use it there, well, then why not repurpose that money for somewhere else, for another place that does have it, or work through that. And that happens in all of those restricted accounts. And, I think that's something we should take a look at, those offline or Ledger 5 accounts. And I think that it's something that we should continue to use, because I know I do, and I assume you do as well. You want us to use the taxpayer money in the most efficient manner possible. And then in terms of controlling it going forward, there needs to be some level of restraint. And I know that while that might make it more difficult, in terms of do you spend it on A or spend it on B, but I think those kinds of decisions are good myself.
Yeah, and I mean, that's really, when we start to look at things, that's how households operate. I mean, if we're talking about in the future, a multi-billion-dollar structural, quote unquote, structural deficit, I mean, do we really need to be spending $250 million a year with the racehorse development fund?
Well, and I'm going to go on further with the bills. Look at just the outstanding bills. You've got pension liabilities. You have liabilities because of the turnpike debt load. That was a horrible act that was passed under the Rendell administration, which all the Democrats supported. I was a no vote on. And they said, well, let's borrow this money against turnpike revenues and drive it into the transportation system, but make the turnpike responsible for visiting it. I don't know if you traveled the turnpike lately. It's not inexpensive. The tolls are very high. And
yeah, so it's the most expensive turnpike system in the world, actually.
Correct. So, there's in addition to just the year-over-year costs, there's a very real problem with all of the IOUs that are sitting in different places as well that need addressed. Personally, I would love to see that. There's delayed payments, and that, I mentioned Health and Human Services is a big issue. Under the Rendell administration, they started delaying payments to providers for 30 days, and then they push it out to 60. And those delays cost those providers real money. So we need to find, in my opinion, I'd love to get that caught up, be more realistic in terms of the timeline, and don't make them incur those costs. Unfortunately, they incurred those costs under the budget impasse as well. And while we're in better financial shape as a Commonwealth because we held the line against all those tax increases, the truth is some of those businesses took months or years to get back on their feet because of the borrowing costs and the instability that was caused by all of that.
Yeah, and that brings up an interesting point, because there's always this conversation around what can we do to improve access and everything like that. And one of the things that we're not talking about is one of the things that is frequently overlooked is the regulatory burden to actually create access. And then the other piece of it is, well, nobody's going to take the whatever government insurance program it is if they're not going to get paid. It's just something that tends to be overlooked. When we look at some of the regulatory things, I know that there was a push at one point to really look at some of the regulations that were suspended during the COVID emergency declaration, to determine whether or not those would actually be, well, they all came back online after the emergency declaration ended. But are we going to take a look at these and say, hey, if we didn't need them then, do we really need them now? Are we going to start meaningfully get rid of some of these things that are just red tape?
Yeah, we've already extended all of those waivers through the end of March. We are looking at doing it again. And actually, you summed it up exactly what I've been saying publicly for some time, and that's this. If you didn't need all of these regulations for the public health, safety, and welfare of the citizens during a once-in-a-century pandemic, do you need them at all? I think the answer is firmly no. And we should take a look at what that is, because it does impact access. I think most of us probably have done doctor's visits like this during the pandemic. You call in, or you need a review or a prescription refill or a counseling session, or whatever the service was that you needed. Many times it turned virtual. Unfortunately, the government regulatory body and sometimes insurance payments are hinged to the government regulatory body that prevent that from probably working to its fullest extent. I think we can balance public safety with public access. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And sometimes when we get on the House floor, that's what the debate becomes about. Well, you just don't want anybody on the internet doing, whatever, whether it's a counseling session or or a medical exam, and I agree. But we need to make the environment where those people who can do it and those who want to participate in that safely should have the ability to do so. So we are looking at the regulatory waivers. We're looking to push them again. I know that's something the Majority Leader's office is working on with some of the members. And as that moves forward, I think that's an absolutely fair question. I think a lot of what has happened during the pandemic, in my opinion, can be summed up in one easy question. Did it work? Did it work? In this case, did doctor's visits online work? The answer is yes, it did. So let's figure out how to make those easier for patients. When you look at the unemployment system, you ask, did it work? And the answer is no, it didn't. It was an abysmal failure in terms of getting people money. I have just had a constituent contact me this week. And imagine being in this position. This individual had their identity stolen. They contacted the Department of Labor and said, hey, wait a minute, I didn't apply for this. Here's all the checks and everything back. And then they actually did lose their job a year later, but there's a hold on their account because of fraudulent activity having been on there before. And, we reached out to the Department of Labor, we helped them figure it out, but it shouldn't take a year to figure that out. And, those are the problems. When you need unemployment, you don't need it a year from now, you need it now. And, I think 7 out of 10 people live paycheck to paycheck. And if that's the case, then you need a system that responds in that same time frame, not months later. And unfortunately, one of the downsides in terms of many of the departments is the timeliness of the responses has simply just disappeared. And that starts at the top, and then secretaries need to work through that. I recognize that there's an unprecedented volume in many of these areas, but then it's incumbent upon them to reach out to us and say, these are the resources we need. This is where we need to go. And, in terms of repurposing money, I think we all agree that it would be a good investment to make sure that whatever we do have works. And in this case, it didn't work. Time and time again, you can see it. The governor's business closure orders at the beginning, it didn't work. In terms of the essential versus non-essential, didn't work. And, thankfully, I think that people are frustrated enough that they have gotten engaged. They have, they've certainly contacted me with their concerns. And, in terms of legislative policy, very few of the ideas that I've ever worked on, were personally mine that I thought up. Many of them were individuals like the gentleman who had the workers, the unemployment issue. He called and said, hey, this is a problem. And, that kind of interaction is exactly what representative government is supposed to be about. You raise your hand, you say there's an issue. Hopefully your representative or senator or whoever that person that you contacted is grabs onto that issue and then runs with it, because government can always do better, and we need to be willing to have those conversations.
Yeah, and I think that the responsiveness piece is really, or the representative democracy piece of it certainly segues pretty nicely into the next kind of issue I wanted to touch on real quick, and that is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which has been, for folks who aren't familiar with it, the governor has basically, through the regulatory process, put Pennsylvania into a regional cap and trade scheme. So that obviously represents, because it's a tax, a very big problem as it relates to the separation of powers and the constitutional role of each branch of government. Where my question comes up, and one of the things that I frequently get asked is, why hasn't the General Assembly in Pennsylvania kind of adopted a similar approach to what we see at the federal level with the power of the purse, and just said, look, we're not going to let you spend the money on this. We're just, we're going to prohibit you from spending money on these things. And that really doesn't seem to be an approach that the General Assembly has taken. There was an instance with it in particular as it relates to, it's not an issue that CAP is focused on, but the University of Pittsburgh was involved in some fetal tissue research and some very questionable stuff. And there was an attempt made to not fund the university, and ultimately the General Assembly did fund it. And we see that kind of time and time again, where we have these not necessarily universities, but different agencies that are just kind of running rampant, and nothing is being done with the power of the purse. It's just kind of kicking the can and, accepting the promise that they'll do better, and then they'll never do better. It's just kind of Lucy keeps moving the football.
Yeah, Leo, actually, specific to the University of Pittsburgh, yes, that issue did come up. I was actually the one who drafted the language that we put in the bill, that it must be used directly for students and not the illegal experiments. That was back in 2018 or 19, correctly. I was majority leader at the time when the issue had come up. And so that is a good example of something that we did and said it has to, essentially go to student tuition offset. We're probably looking at going a little further on that issue this time. I know the members of the Southwest delegation have taken the lead on that, and they're looking at, perhaps working through FIA in rather than sending it to an institution. And I think personally, I think that, just like you or I as consumers can decide where to go and if we want to support something or not, I think that really should be the same in the student world. They should be able to pick a school. You shouldn't just get tuition assistance if you go to one of these half a dozen schools. It should be, in my opinion, if the government's going to make it, it should be an equal opportunity to compete for kind of thing. So that's one example. The other example is we really do control a lot of the spending through the fiscal code. I know a lot of folks always complain about that every year because it is a very lengthy document. And sometimes things are in there that people don't like, myself included. But those are where we kind of put the guardrails on what the money can be used for, what it can't be used for, what's appropriate. And many times, and this gets back into the Ledger 5 accounts, that money ends up not being used. So then it sits in an account that's not been tapped as a surplus. So I think we ought to do a better job of clawing that back myself. That's something that I did try to get into some of the code bills, but was unsuccessful in terms of lapsing that funding, because I do believe that the power of appropriations is only ours and that we should do that going forward. Specific to Reggie, there's a whole host of problems with Reggie. One, let's talk about what it's going to mean to you and I and everybody in the Commonwealth. It means our power costs are going to go up. So that's a very real outcome of that. I think it was originally predicted to be like $2 or $3 per measurement in terms of cost, and I think it's many, many times that already in terms of what's going on. So that's going to be a substantial increase over what was advertised. Second, you hit on the other one, which is the constitutional conflict. I do not believe, and I think the governor is wrong, that he can unilaterally enter us into an interstate compact through an executive regulatory effort such as he's doing. We're going to be in court over that. We already disapproved it both as a Senate and a House. We notified him of that. And unfortunately, we need to now either override the veto and challenge him in court. We'll hopefully be able to do both, because that's a very real issue. And then just practically, let's look at what happens when you enter an interstate compact. We've got lots of examples of interstate compacts. You could live in the Delaware River Basin, the Susquehanna River Basin, and they both have compacts. Both of those we legislatively enacted, signed by the governor, and had appointments to them. That is the process to enter an interstate compact. Now, one of the problems of an interstate compact, quite frankly, is how difficult it is to get out of it. We've had issues with the SRBC and the DRBC through the years. And you've got to get all the other partners to then disagree. And in this case, with the governor unilaterally putting himself in, and this is one of the challenges of executive orders, and it doesn't matter, if it's Republican or Democrat governor or president, doesn't matter. They can come and go as quickly as possible. And that instability, I think, is not good for us as citizens. It's not good for, in this case, the power markets. And I just don't think it's a realistic representation of where individuals want to go. We had a very robust debate on Reggie in terms of what it meant to consumers, what it means to businesses, what it means to jobs. And, the General Assembly overwhelmingly voted to not go there. We are the body that is closest to the people, and we're elected to represent them. And so I hope as we, both pursue the legislative remedy, which is a potential veto override, and the court remedy, which is he doesn't have the authority to do that unilaterally. I do think that I do hope that the Constitution wins out in the end.
Speaking of the Constitution, and we have very little time left, Is there anything that the legislature can do to actually rein in the courts, particularly the Supreme Court, which has a tendency to, just kind of decide that it has powers that it doesn't, like drawing congressional maps, for instance?
Yeah, the Supreme Court, and I'll try to be quick. The Supreme Court has unfortunately been very aggressive in what I will call the extrajudicial realm, and really have turned themselves into a super legislature many times. Whether it's redrawing the lines, which is clearly given to us as a General Assembly, or rewriting the voting laws that were in place, in terms of illegally extending the deadlines. Unfortunately, we appealed that the whole way to the United States Supreme Court and lost. I respectfully disagree with the courts on that. I think they got it wrong, because I do think that it is the purview of the General Assembly in terms of when and how and the manner of which elections take place. So when you look at some of the constitutional amendments, it's not just the courts that actually need reined in. We actually sent a package over earlier, currently in the Senate, which really does several different things. One, it would rein in the regulatory process where we wouldn't have to present it to the governor, risk of veto. So Reggie, had this been in place, then this whole Reggie executive order would not have happened. Two, it would also limit the secretary's ability to only do emergencies in consistency with what the governor can. Remember, we clipped the governor's days down 90 to 21, but yet, with the school mask mandate, that went on well beyond 21 days. And the idea that a secretary could actually have more power than a governor is just ludicrous. So we said, no, the secretary, you can only delegate the power that you actually have. You can't create power and then give it away. So if you're limited to 21 days, your secretary should be too. And then the last component deals with election audits and how that would occur. And all directed towards the executive branch. Power of the purse is always one. We hit on that one already. I think that's a viable one going forward. But the truth of the matter is, the biggest portion of the budget, the legislature's anywhere between 1.5% and 2%. Courts are usually about the same, which really means that 96% of the budget that we open the program with is all executive branch expenditures. That's where it keeps growing. While we're discussing the separation of powers, the costs are actually coming from the executive branch.
Yeah. And I think that is a good note to end things on. I appreciate the time that you've taken today to come on. Was there anything you wanted to touch on quick?
No, I want to thank you for having me on. I want to thank you for discussing some heavier issues, because in today's world, oftentimes 30-second sound bites. Some of this dialogue can't happen in 30 seconds, because you got to explain the history, you got to explain where you're going and what you're trying to do. So I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, Leo.
Thanks again for coming on today. Everybody, our guest today was Pennsylvania House Speaker Bryan Cutler. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we look forward to talking to you again in the future.